Amen. You can turn in your Bibles to Isaiah 28. Portion of inspiration that I'm sure all of us are familiar with. The historical context: Solomon has died centuries before. The 12 tribes have separated. In the northern part of the land there are 10 tribes, in the southern part there are 2 tribes. And therefore we have this north-south divide. Both parties are in rebellion to God. Both are steeped in idolatry, committing sin. And if you look through the work of what people generally term the major and the minor prophets, it's all dealing with this subject. In fact, if you were to peruse the Old Testament and just looked at the subject matter that was being discussed in all of those 39 books, around 60% of everything that you will read is all connected with the punishment that God is going to inflict upon the 12 tribes because of the breaking of the covenant. Around 60% of it is dealing with that subject. And the punishment that I'm referring to specifically is the Babylonian captivity. If you start considering the punishment of the Egyptian captivity, the percentage gets even higher. So the vast majority, around 60% of the Old Testament, is dealing with one subject. It's really the punishment of God's people, and that punishment is the Babylonian captivity because of the breaking of the covenant that they had entered into with God. At least one reference point would be Sinai. They've come out of Egyptian captivity, they've entered into covenant, and the breaking of that covenant that they had entered into centuries before, punishment is now going to be meted out through the Babylonian captivity. I say Babylonians, but it's also the Assyrian punishment that happens as well. The Assyrians and the Babylonians can be, at least at one level, understood to be a singular people. The Bible does separate them. If you keep your hand in Isaiah 28, and we were to go to the book of Jeremiah, just to make that point, Jeremiah chapter 50. As you turn in there, I've given you a sort of a percentage, sort of 60% number, but it's not so straightforward as that, because if you were to look at books like Genesis, Leviticus, Exodus, that type of approach, some books are completely dedicated to this subject and other books are not. So, for instance, the book of Leviticus would touch this subject about the captivity, but the main focus of the book isn't dealing with that. It's dealing with something else. Again, the book of Exodus is not really dealing with the subject of the Babylonian captivity. The title gives it away. It's the leaving of Egypt, hence the Exodus. But there are other books that deal with exclusively with it. The book of Haggai, Zechariah, or what we would call most of the minor prophets, The latter part of the Old Testament, the vast majority of those books, those letters, those admonitions, are all dealing with the Babylonian captivity. And I'll say it in this way: how you get into captivity, which is the sins, what happens when you go into captivity, the Babylonian captivity itself, and then what happens when you get out. So it's the cause of the trouble, what the trouble or the punishment looks like, and what happens when you leave and there's some restoration. So most of the Old Testament is going to be dealing with this subject. I've said the Assyrians and the Babylonians are essentially one people. We're in Isaiah chapter 50, and we're going to just look at verse 17. Isaiah 50 verse 17. Sorry, Jeremiah. Isaiah is a scattered sheep. The lions have driven him away. First, the king of Assyria hath devoured him, and last, this Nebuchadrezzar, king of Babylon, hath broken his bones. So this is an interesting verse, because if we were to put it in a timeline, and we were to say first the Assyrians and then the Babylonians, Jeremiah is actually speaking here. Israel is a scattered sheep. The lions have driven him away. First the king of Assyria hath devoured him, and last this Nebuchadrezzar, king of Babylon, hath broken his bones. So Jeremiah is using the word Israel to represent the 12 tribes. So sometimes in the Old Testament, the word Israel is not used to identify the 12 tribes. It's used to identify the 10 tribes. It can, depending on the context. So you could have Israel and Judah. Israel would be the 10 tribes, and Judah would be the 2. Sometimes it's not called Israel. It can be called Ephraim. Sometimes Manasseh. So there are various titles for those 10 tribes. Sometimes it's Israel, sometimes it's Ephraim, sometimes it's Manasseh. And the 2 tribes, Judah and Benjamin, are often just called Judah. But sometimes it's also identified as Jerusalem by the city. And if we were going to do that for the 10 tribes, the city that we would identify would be the Samaria, from where the word Samaritan comes from. So the word Samaritan comes from the locality or the city called Samaria. So you can identify God's people in different ways with different words. If you're going to do a city, you could do Samaria and Jerusalem. If you're going to name them, you could have Manasseh, Ephraim or Israel for the 10, and then Judah for the 2. But here in Jeremiah 50, he's using the word Israel to cover all of the 12 tribes. The verse itself is relatively straightforward. It's identifying this people from, if I can call the locality Shinar, what we might call modern Iraq today, basically. Shinar is where Babel was located. I'm sure we all probably know that. And Shinar, the word itself, means a land that's between 2 cities. Between 2 rivers. The land between 2 rivers. The 2 rivers are the River Euphrates and the River Tigris. Rivers that everyone's heard of the Euphrates. You may or may not have heard of the Tigris River. There's a triangular land. It's bordered by these 2 rivers, Euphrates and Tigris, It's called the land of Shinar. It's where Babel was built. And that land is where the Assyrians and the Babylonians are located. The Bible sometimes speaks about these two people as a singular entity, sometimes here, using the same symbol, which is a symbol of a lion. It splits them between the Assyrians and the Babylonians. And the reason it does that is because it's going to mark that the 10 tribes, so we'll put 10 here, the 10 tribes are scattered or punished by the Assyrians, and the 2 tribes are going to be punished or scattered by the Babylonians. They're both identified by a singular symbol of a lion. So one set of lion is the Assyrians, and the second lion is the Babylonians, and Israel has been scattered by both lions. The 10 tribes are going to be scattered by the Assyrian lion, and the 2 tribes are going to be scattered by the Babylonian lion. When Jeremiah is writing this chapter, the work of destruction by this lion, the Assyrian lion, has already been accomplished. They've already been scattered. The work for the 2 tribes here by Babylon has already begun, but its work is not completed yet. So if we were to think about cities, Samaria and Jerusalem, Samaria has been scattered a long time ago, destroyed, but Jerusalem hasn't been yet, although the work of destruction has already begun. If you go back to Isaiah 28, Isaiah 28 is going to follow the same theme. It's going to be dealing with the destruction of these 12 tribes, Israel. It's going to be the destruction of these people in 2 steps. We begin in verse 1. It says, "Woe to the crown of pride, to the drunkards of Ephraim, whose glorious beauty is a fading flower, which are on the head of the fat valleys of them that are overcome with wine." If you drop down to verse 3, "The crown of pride, the drunkards of Ephraim shall be trodden underfoot." So without going into the verse and explaining it in any depth, what I want to suggest, when it talks about the crown of pride, it's talking about the leaders or the leadership of this group of people who are called Ephraim. It's not talking about, you could identify it to a singular person, a king, but it really is the capital city that it's dealing with. So when it says Ephraim here, it's the usage here, Ephraim. It's dealing with the 10 tribes, and it's talking about the pride or the crown or the glory of the 10 tribes. The pride, the glory, or the crown of the 10 tribes is that jeweled city called Samaria. That's what it's dealing with here. And if you look at verse 1, it talks about the head of the fat valleys of them that are overcome with wine. If you go to verse 4, it uses very similar language to verse 1. "The glorious beauty which is on the head of the fat valley shall be a fading flower, as the hasty fruit before summer, which when he that looketh upon it seeth, when it is yet in his hand, he eateth it up." So all I want to point out here is that there are 2 themes that are going to be used to try to explain what's going on. One of them is the theme of geography. If you go back to verse 1, it talks about the head of the fat valleys. So a valley is a geographical location. We know what a valley is. It's a piece of land that's between two mountains. And here it talks about the head of the valley. I'm sure, even though we might not know the technical description of what that means, you know what the head of a valley is. If you're at one end of the valley, the head of the valley would be at one end of it, just at that simple level. It's a geographical model that's being portrayed to us there. And in verse 4, you'll notice that it uses the word summer. And when it used the word summer, it spoke about fruit. It says hasty fruit. If you were to go to look at that word hasty, you'd see that essentially it really means the fruit that's come first or prematurely. We would call that the first fruit, the fruit that has arrived at the earlier stage of summer, or we would call that harvest. Now I know in different parts of the world, summer may not necessarily be harvest, but in this part of the world, in the Middle East, that's when they would have their harvest in summer. So we've got a model of geography, and we've got a model of agriculture. And you can see how Isaiah is combining those two thoughts together. So, the geography, the head of the fat valleys, the word fat valley means abundant, luxurious, verdure, a place where you can get good crops. The head is referring to the capital of that part of the country. The city of Samaria was put on a hill like most capital cities were for protection, and it overlooks this fertile valley. There's a lot of symbology tucked into the language here, but that's what that geography is going to show us. It's going to allude to Samaria, which is the chief or capital city that sits over this fertile valley, or in reality it'd probably be a small plain, surrounded by a chain of hills or small mountains. So that's the geography model that's being used. It's going to help to locate where we are, who we're referring to, and then there's the agricultural model, which is talking about harvest. So you've got two models that we're dealing with. In verse 4, the agricultural model is going to be used to describe destruction. I don't know if you can see that in verse 4 as you read it. The last part of the verse, or the second part, and there's the hasty fruit before the summer, which when he that looketh upon it seeth, while it is yet in his hand, he eateth it up. So someone is going to come to this. Where's he going to come to? He's going to come to the fat valley. He's going to come to this place of abundance, and before the proper time, when would the proper time be? Harvest. Before harvest, he's going to notice that there is fruit that's hasty, or what we might call the first fruit, that is ready before time, if we can say it that way. And when he sees it, what will he do with it? Two steps. What was the first thing he's going to do? He's going to put it where? He's going to put it into his hand, and when it's in his hand, what will he immediately do? Eat it. So even without thinking too deeply about it, we can have a good idea of what this symbol is about. Do you know a story that someone grabs a piece of fruit, it's in their hand, and they eat it?
Adam.
Yeah, the story of Adam and Eve. Now, if you go to the story of Adam and Eve, and you see the sin that they've committed, what's their punishment? I know it's death, I don't mean that.
Cast out.
Sorry?
They're being cast out.
They're going to be cast out. Why are they cast out of the Garden of Eden? What does God say would happen if they remained?
Curse the land.
In case they
You will curse the land.
curse the land. What happens if they remain in Eden? Sorry? They'll be sinners forever. How will they be sinners forever?
Because of the tree of life.
And how would they do that? It says, lest they put forth their hand and take the fruit. Now, when you see that word hand that's used in the scriptures, it's not a hand like this, just a hand. The way hand is used in the Bible, in English, it doesn't portray the idea that God is given in the original language when it uses the word hand. It's various parts of the hand. So you could have the hand, which used to be the palm, or it could be the fingers. But when it uses the hand in the book of Genesis, when it says, lest he put forth his hand and take from the fruit, that hand, there is a very similar usage here. Because what's this person going to do? He's going to go to a tree, he's going to grab the hand, and so he's going to grab the fruit. So I've already given the clue by the word grab. So in Genesis and here, the way the word hand is used, what that word actually means is if this was the fruit, what you're going to do is not just get a hand. The hand is going to go there and you're going to do something. What would you do? You'd wrap your fingers around it and grab it. Once you have grabbed that fruit, give another analogy. You're in a fight with someone, and in the midst of this fight, you grab hold of their neck and you squeeze. What's your relationship to your assailant if you've grabbed hold of their neck? Your strength, you're holding them.
In control.
You're in control. So this idea of hand is the one that's in control of the situation, or the one that has power. So, as I say, you have to check what the word itself, the word hand, means in its context. But in this context, it's the same context as Genesis. And what is being portrayed is someone who is in control, or someone who has power. Because if you take a piece of fruit and you wrap your fingers around it, and you need all 5 digits to do that. I know it's most of us have got thumbs and we haven't received an injury, but one of the things that makes us so powerful as creatures, if I could use it that way, compared to other creatures, is our thumb. We know that? Yeah? If you don't have a thumb, it becomes extremely difficult to actually use our hands. It's really difficult. This thumb that wraps around things and you have this grip is really useful. If you didn't have it and you tried doing that, you'll see that you don't have a good grip. It's really not easy to use. So a thumb really becomes a symbol of this powerful hand that we have, or the symbol of power. So what I want to point out here is that it speaks about Ephraim, which is the 10 tribes. It speaks about geography, and the use of geography is going to show us that it's the capital city of Samaria that's being dealt with, or the city where the king resides. Then it's going to switch to an agricultural model, and it's going to say, before the time of harvest, someone is going to come and they're going to have control of Samaria. They're going to take control of Samaria, put it into their power, and what will they do? Eat it up or destroy it. And the destruction, it says in the verse 4, while it is yet in his hand, he eateth it up. And that imagery there is an imagery that as soon as he grabs hold of Samaria, he's going to destroy it immediately. I think most of us are familiar with the story that's being spoken of here. It's 721, 723 BC. It's not shown on these charts, by the way, and that was for good reason. It wasn't shown on these charts. The Millerites are aware of the dates, 721, 723 BC. But Miller, or we can say they, decide not to use that date. They're going to use another date. And the date they're going to use, as we're all familiar, it's here in small font, 677, but on this one it's in large font, 677 up there. So this is 677 BC, and the date that's been referred to here in verses 1 to 4 that we're dealing with is, depending on how you do BC, 723, 721. The siege of Samaria and its eventual destruction. That's the northern tribes, and the reason why the Millerites never put that date on their chart, even though they're familiar with it, is because they're going to track, or they're going to run a story of the southern tribes. If we're okay with that idea. They do that for very good reason. So this is the story of the 2520. If we can, if we're familiar with what 723 is dealing with, Isaiah 28 is the story of the 2520. Does anybody not know what I'm referring to if I say that? We're all familiar with the 2520, at least to some degree. It's a number that's on this chart here. It's right here, 2520. They've got 677 and it goes to 1843. They tell you how they calculate the 2520. So they use one 2520 theme here. You can do another one. It would begin in 723, which is this destruction that's been referred to, and it goes to its end in 1798, if you're okay with that. So Isaiah 28 is dealing with the 2520. The reason why this one is interesting for us, because if you go to 723 BC and you get to 1798, and we're not going to be dealing with the mathematics of all of this, if you go halfway into this story, what date do you come up with? Good, 538. This is 538 AD, and if you just work out the maths, most people are familiar with this. It's the 1260, and this too would be 1260. And if you add these together, you'd get this 2520. The same 2520 that's on this chart, but they just have a different start date. So we're not getting into the intricacies of that. If we were to get these two 1260s, and we were to consider this one, what time period do we call this? Comes on various names. We know...
Time of danger.
Sorry?
Time of gender.
The times of the Gentiles. The Bible speaks about the times of the Gentiles. So I'm going to call this the period of papal persecution. If you're okay with that. This is papal persecution. And if this is papal persecution, this story is pagan persecution. So you've got pagan persecution and papal persecution. And if we were to look at either one of these two statues, all of that imagery that's in that statue is all shown here. I think we're all familiar with that. So this pagan persecution, we can divide into 4 segments. If you go to Daniel chapter 2, it's all here on this chart, we'd see that this was Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome, pagan. If you're okay with that, that would be the head, the body, the thighs, and the legs. Straight from Daniel 2. And if we were to do that, this would then be also Rome, but it's papal. And this would be the feet and toes of iron and clay. Everybody okay with that? Yeah? So, I think that's relatively straightforward. We all know that. We're in Isaiah 28. There's the destruction that's been predicted of Samaria, the head or the capital of the 10 tribes of Ephraim. Woe to the crown of pride, Isaiah 28 verse 1, to the drunkards of Ephraim. So that's all of them, all 10 tribes, whose glorious beauty is the fading flower which are on the head of the fat valleys of them that are overcome with wine. Going back to dropping down to verse 4, and the glorious beauty which is on the head of the fat valleys shall be a fading flower, and as the hasty fruit before summer, which when he that looketh upon it seeth, while it is yet in his hand, he eateth it up. So I want to suggest, when you look at the context of what's being discussed here, that this is being written before the destruction of Samaria. This is written before that. So if we were to take this line, Jeremiah 50 was here, and Isaiah 28 is here. Isaiah 28 is being written before the destruction of Samaria by Assyria. So I'll put 723 here. So this is written before that event. It's a prediction of what's going to happen. If we go back to verse 2, Isaiah 28 verse 2, he says, Behold, the Lord hath a mighty and strong one, which as a tempest of hail and a destroying storm, as a flood of mighty waters overflowing, shall cast down to the earth with the hand. So we can see the use of the hand here in verse 2. It's the same hand that's been referred to in verse 4. In verse 4 it says, which when he that looketh upon it seeth it. So it talks about the pronoun he. He's going to look at this fruit and he's going to see it and then take it into his hand and eat it up. And if you go back to verse 2, it says, Behold, the Lord hath a mighty and strong one. So it tells you that there's a person, a mighty strong person, and then it's going to symbolize this person in the following way. It says, which as, or which looks like, or which is going to behave like, or which has the appearance of a tempest of hail, a destroying storm, a flood of mighty waters overflowing. So it's described in 3 different ways: tempest of hail, destroying storm, as a flood of waters, and then it tells you what it will do. It will cast down to the earth with the hand. So that hand is going to cast Ephraim, the head of the fat valleys, to the ground. The crown of pride, the drunkards of Ephraim, shall be trodden underfoot. So first the hand is going to throw them to the ground, and then what will happen? They'll be trodden down with the feet. So you've got a symbol of the hand, and you've got the symbol of a feet. So in a literal battle, you can imagine, or you could sort of visualize what would happen. You're in hand-to-hand combat, and you get your opponent, you either kill them with a weapon, or you wound them, and they fall to the ground, and what would happen? You just march over them. The army would just continue to go in the direction that it needs to go to obviously win the war, and you just march over people and flatten them. So that's what that imagery is. We've discussed the subject of the hand. So a hand equals what? Power. Good. We didn't go into Strong's and look at the original usage and do a proper study on it. So you should really do that to confirm this. But if you were to do that, you would see not every time the word hand is used, because there are different original Hebrew or Greek words that are used as hand, but in this context, hand means power. Now it also speaks about the foot. So again, we're not going to do a study on what a foot is. So the symbol of a foot comes up in different stories. There's the foot washing that we're all aware of, the symbol of, or the service of humility that precedes communion. And that symbol there can mean different things, the symbol of a foot, depending on what story we're going to use. So without going into a study on this, I want to say that the symbol of a foot is the gospel. The Bible speaks about people having beautiful feet, doing what? What do you do with your beautiful feet?
Carrying the good news.
Carrying the good news, yes? And what is a beautiful foot? Thinking about the foot washing service. What would a beautiful foot be?
Clean foot.
A clean foot, yeah? So once you've got a clean foot, you're going to give a beautiful gospel message, or a message of salvation, yeah? So I want to change it from gospel, because what is gospel? If it's a simple definition of what the word gospel would be, what would we say the gospel is?
Message.
Message. So often we use the word good news. And it's that word news that we can pick up, and my brother wants to say that the word news is message. If you're okay with that. So a foot would symbolize a good message, but it can also symbolize a bad message. Yeah?
Yeah.
So this message, if I came to give you a message, what would I be doing? I'd be delivering some information. Now, if you already knew the information, would I need to deliver it to you? No. So it's something that you are not aware of. It's something that's not happening now, and it's only a small step from the word gospel to good news to message to say that it's a prediction of something that's about to happen. So I want to say that the gospel is really a message that predicts something that can either be good, if it's the gospel, but it could also be something bad. So I want to call this a message or a prediction. So what we've done is we've taken the symbol foot. We know that people who have got beautiful feet, they've been washed clean, will have a beautiful message, because the symbol of a foot is the symbol of the gospel. Gospel is good news. News is message, and it's a message of something that God is going to promise you, or He's offering to give you that you don't currently have. That's what the gospel is. You go and give the gospel to a Gentile because they don't have that good news. They don't have that experience, or what we would call salvation. If we're okay with all of that. Keep your hand in Isaiah 28. Now we want to go to the book Habakkuk. This is not the only place that this word is going to be found. The word I'll tell you of in a second. But this is a nice chapter. So as you're turning to the book Habakkuk, Habakkuk is, if Isaiah was here and this was the destruction of Samaria, so you've got Isaiah 28, the destruction of Samaria, and you've got Jeremiah 50, which says that Samaria was destroyed and Jerusalem is going to be destroyed. So I've given you two prophets here, Isaiah and Jeremiah. If you were to put Habakkuk in that line, Habakkuk would be here. And we're going to look at Habakkuk 1. So we've got Isaiah, Habakkuk, Jeremiah. Just to give you a context of where those prophets are in the stories that we're looking at. We're going to do this backwards. We're going to go to verse 6. Habakkuk 1:6. For lo, I raise up the Chaldeans, that bitter and hasty nation, which shall march through the breadth of the land to possess the dwelling places that are not theirs. So, who are the Chaldeans?
Syrian, Babylonian.
These are the Babylonians specifically. They're not the Assyrians. So if you went to Jeremiah 50, it said, first the Assyrians, then this Nebuchadrezzar, we call it Nebuchadnezzar, it has a variant spelling in the Bible. This Nebuchadrezzar, this is the Chaldeans that are being referred to here. So it says that I'm going to raise up the Chaldeans. So if the Chaldeans have not been raised up yet, that means what? You're before this destruction here. The Chaldeans are not here yet to do their work. If we're okay with that? So that's why I've put Habakkuk here, because the Chaldeans have not been raised up yet. It says, I will raise up the Chaldeans. I'm going to raise up the Babylonians. Okay with that? Drop back to verse 5. Behold ye among the heathen. What does behold mean? Simply, look. It means look. So verse 5 says what? The first part of the verse.
Look.
Look at the heathen. Look at the Gentiles. Okay? So if he's saying look at the Gentiles, who is he speaking to? Speaking to his own. He's not speaking to the Chaldeans, no. God is speaking to his people. He's speaking to the Jewish nation, and he's going to tell him to do what? Look at the Gentiles. So if you're, we'll call it the church, he says to the church, look at the world. Look at what's in front of you. Read the newspapers. Watch the television. Go on the internet. And have a look. See what the situation is. So what God is saying is that go and look at the political situation of the world as it currently is. That's what verse 5 is saying. God's people, you Israelites, my children, go and look at the world. See what it looks like today. That's the first part of the verse. Behold ye among the nations. So go and look at all the nations of the world. Now they don't have the internet, they don't have TV. So what is their world? How big is their world? Small. We'll go with that. It's a small world. It's not Europe, certainly not the Americas, certainly not at least the lower part of Africa, because we know it's Northern Africa would be there, Ethiopia, Egypt, certainly not the East, China, Philippines, certainly not Australasia. So it's a very small world that they've got. So he says, look at the world that you live in and look at the nations and regard and wonder marvelously. What does that mean if I said regard and wonder marvelously? If you wondered marvelously, what would you think if I said wonder marvelously? Sorry? Imagine. So if you imagine something, it means that thing is not there to see. Yeah? Sorry?
You born upon it.
Yes. So the word marvelous is something unusual, something great. We could use the word miracle. Something strange is going to happen. And wonder marvelously, for I will work a work in your days which you will not believe, though it be told you. So as God told them, He's told them, right in verse 5, are they going to believe? No. Why would you not believe something that God tells you? Because you can't see it. So He says, I'm going to tell you something that's going to happen. And you can't see it. What did He tell you to do at the beginning of verse 5? To look. He says, look at the political landscape. I'm going to tell you something. And what can you not do? You can't see it. You can't see what I'm talking about. And it says, behold marvelously. So let's summarize all of that into plain language. God is going to tell His people, look at the political landscape in your world. It's a very small world. And I'm going to do something in your world, politically speaking, that is not there at the moment, and it would be such a surprising thing that you wouldn't actually believe that it's possible that this thing could happen. So, what is the thing that is not there at the moment, because He says, have a look, it's not there, but it's going to happen, but you're not going to believe that it's possible that this thing could happen? Sorry? The Babylonians. That's where verse 6 comes. I'm going to raise the Chaldeans. I'm going to raise up the Babylonians. So the Babylonians are they're not a famous people. They're around because He says the Chaldeans, they know about them, but they're an insignificant people. And so when He says, look around the political world, what I'm going to do is I'm going to get the Babylonians and I'm going to raise them to prominence. And for that to happen, it would be a marvelous thing, a miracle. Why would it be so impossible for the Babylonians to be raised up? And that word raised up means to come to prominence. Why would it be a miraculous thing for that to happen? Because someone is keeping them down. To rise up politically, how does that work? War. Has to be war. Someone's going to destroy someone else to be raised up. Who's stopping the Babylonians from raising up? The Assyrians. The Assyrians are the superpower of the day. And they control everybody. They control Israel, their archenemy, the Egyptians. The Medo-Persians are subdued. They're not a major player. And their next door neighbours, their cousins, if you like, the Babylonians, are kept in subjection. And God's going to do a miracle. He's going to raise up the Babylonians, and no one can believe this could happen. The Assyrians are reasonable people. You can negotiate with them. You can bribe them. What are the Babylonians like? What does it say about them? Verse 6, they're a bitter and hasty nation. Remember we read that word hasty before? This is a nasty group of people. Okay, so the context here is Habakkuk is after the Assyrians have done their work, destroying Samaria. And they were quite reasonable with the Sumerians, actually. They were saying, if you continue to pay us protection money, we will take care of you. Just like a mob. So they're the superpower. He says, these people are going to be destroyed, and I'm going to raise up the Babylonians. So that's what Habakkuk is saying. By the time Jeremiah's here, the Babylonians are already in power. They've already begun to do this hasty work. But they haven't completely destroyed. So all of that was to give you the backdrop of verse 1. So verse 1 says the burden which Habakkuk the prophet did see. So there's a prophet who's going to see something. What do prophets see? Visions. So he's going to see a vision, and he's going to explain what this vision is through these chapters. We call that a prophecy. So the burden which Habakkuk did see would mean the vision that he saw, or the prophecy that he's going to give. That word burden there is a prophecy. You could substitute the word prophecy or vision for that. It means just the word. This prophecy, is it positive or negative?
Negative.
It's a negative message, which is where we get this idea of feet. So the feet can be good news, but what can they also be?
Bad news.
They can also be bad news. It's a symbol of bad news depending on the context. So there's the bad news that's coming upon God's people. In Isaiah 28, once they've got power, there's this message that's going to come to destroy or to harm the people. It's a bad message. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. So that's what Habakkuk is. We looked at verse 5 and 6, and we looked at verse 1. So there's a vision, because that's what prophets have, isn't it? Which is a prophecy, and the prophecy is this, that a miraculous thing is going to happen in the geopolitical world. And what's that miracle? That the superpower, which is Assyria, is going to be brought low by this relatively unknown, weak nation called the Chaldeans. We call them the Babylonians. They're going to rise to power. Who allows them to rise to power? God. It says in verse 6, I will raise up. The way God uses this language of him doing things, we have to be careful how we understand what that means. And then the rest of the chapter, chapter 1, tells you what they will do. They're going to destroy God's people. That's this here. That's the destruction that we read in Jeremiah 50. First, the Assyrians. Then, this Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian, the Chaldean, is going to break the bones of Jerusalem. Habakkuk chapter 2. You're familiar with this passage. When it talks about taking the vision and writing it on tables. Verse 2. And the Lord answered me and said, write the vision and make it plain upon tables, that he may run that readeth it. So, based upon what we've looked at already, when we see the word run, what does that mean? Feet. So we'll jump all the way to the end. When it says, he may run that readeth it, what does that mean? Someone's going to read something, and what will they do? They'll take the news. They're going to give the message. Is it good news or bad news?
Bad news.
This is bad news. They're going to run. You run with your feet. There's bad news. What word does Habakkuk use? He uses the word burden. This bad prophecy, this bad news. Okay with that? So, the vision is what? It's the prophecy, it's the burden. And what is that prophecy? That the superpower is going to be brought down and someone is going to be raised up, and when they get raised up, we don't really care because it's the world, but what will they come and do? They're going to come and destroy us, and therefore, God's people, and therefore, this is bad news. So, once you understand that, what are you supposed to do?
Run.
Which means?
Yeah.
It doesn't mean, it does not mean run away. It means to tell people that this thing is about to happen. So as each of us learn, we're supposed to be messengers that share this news to God's people. We're okay with that? So let's summarize. We're here in Habakkuk. We've got 3 prophets, Isaiah, Habakkuk, Jeremiah. They're all telling the same story. There's a prophecy of the destruction of first Samaria and then Jerusalem. All 3 prophets are dealing with the same subject. They're dealing with the subject at different time periods. Isaiah is dealing with the subject before any destruction happens. Isaiah 28. No destruction has happened yet, neither for Samaria nor Jerusalem. Habakkuk, that message happens after Samaria has been destroyed, but before the Babylonians have even come into power yet. The Assyrians are still powerful. So it's quite early. And then by the time you get to Jeremiah, not only has Samaria been destroyed, but Jerusalem has already been invaded and it's about to be destroyed. The Babylonians are already here. So they're all dealing with the same subject, but they're approaching it differently because they're in different time periods, if we're okay with that. Let's go back to Isaiah 28. I'm just going to go back to Habakkuk, but I'm not going to read the verses, but I'm quoting from chapter 2, and I'm just going to paraphrase. So there's no need to even read the verses that I'm going to refer to. It's the first few verses of Habakkuk chapter 2. We're here. You don't believe that the Babylonians could even come to prominence. It's impossible for that to happen because the Assyrians are so powerful. So what Habakkuk is going to do, and Habakkuk becomes a symbol of all of the messengers in God's church, they're going to read the statement which was the burden of Habakkuk. They're going to read the prophecy, read the bad message, and they're going to share it with people. So if you share a prophetic message, bad message, you can be considered to be obviously a messenger. But the Bible doesn't often use the phrase messenger in the Old Testament because it's all with a kind of a militaristic symbol. What word would we use? If you're going to tell someone that something's about to happen in a kind of a militaristic perspective. So I'll draw a castle. Did you say preach?
Security guard.
So we'll go with security guard. We'll go with security guard, but the Bible doesn't use the word security guard. What does it use? Watchman. Okay, so we've got a watchman. If you went to Habakkuk chapter 2 verse 1, don't turn back there, but it says, I will stand upon my watch. What does that mean? It's my time period when I'm on guard, security guard, yeah? So this is the watchman. So what Habakkuk's going to say is that there are going to be people who understand the burden. They're going to predict that the Babylonians are going to come and no one is going to believe them. We already established that. So he's going to be now identified as this watchman. And this watchman is looking on the parapet over the wall, and what's he going to say? He's going to look in his binoculars and he's going to say what? I can see who? He says, I can see the Babylonians coming. That's what he's going to say? Yeah? And his brother, or his friend, his wife, husband, is going to come and say, give me those binoculars, let me have a look. And when they look, what did they say?
Yeah, I can see the webland. They don't see no one.
They say, I can't see anyone, there's no one there. Remember, it says, though I tell you, you will not believe. Yes? So, one person says, the watchman, I can see them right in front, and the other one says, I can't. What they're going to get into? They're going to get into a fight. They're going to get into an argument, and this person's going to reprove. What does that reprove? What does the word reprove mean? Tell you off. So I'm going to tell you off because you're talking rubbish or lies, fake information. It's not true what you're saying. Yep. Today we call it fake news. So we, the watchman, who has taken the burden, the vision, can see the Babylonians coming, but their colleague, their friend, is looking in the same direction, and can they see? No, they can't see. So there's an argument in God's church. By the way, why can't they see? In real life, you're here, can you actually see the Babylonians coming? When you read the newspaper, when you go on the internet,
No,
you can't, because it says in 1 verse 5, Habakkuk 1:5, what did it say? Wonder marvelously, for I will work a work in your days which you will not believe. Behold ye among the heathen. It says, look at the geopolitical world, and something's about to happen, but it hasn't happened yet. So the Babylonians haven't arisen, but I'm saying I can see them. So we would say you can see them by faith. We can use that. We can see them by faith. So if you read the newspaper, could you see them?
no.
No. But if you read the word of the prophet, the burden, you can definitely see it's going to happen. But when he says, look at the heathen, you can begin to see something going on. Otherwise, he wouldn't tell you to go to the heathen. Where would he tell you to look? He'd say, go and check with the prophet. Go and study the word of God and you'll see it. But he doesn't. So it's a play on word. He says, go and look at the political world, and you won't be able to see it directly, but you can see threads of this already happening. And if you go back to the history where Habakkuk is, you can already begin to see the threads of these things happening. The beginning of the Chaldeans, the Babylonians. But it's really hard to believe. So there's this argument that's going to happen, that someone says it can happen and someone says it can't happen. So that's what that story in Habakkuk's all about. You come to Isaiah 28. We're here. Isaiah 28, the first few verses, verse 2, we read that already. Behold, the Lord hath a mighty and strong one. Who is the mighty strong one that's going to destroy the head of the fertile valley? The head of the fertile valley is Samaria. Who's going to come and destroy that? The Assyrians. So the Assyrian is the strong and mighty one. We okay with that? Yeah? So if you go down through the verses, it sort of explains all of that. And then you get down to verse 7. We're not going to read from verse 7, but what I want to read is from verse 14. Read from verse 14. Wherefore hear the word of the Lord, ye scornful men that rule the people which is in Jerusalem. So verse 14, we've switched from where to where? The head of the fat valley to verse 14? To Judah. It says Jerusalem in the verse. So we've gone from the head of the fat valley, which is Samaria, here, and now we've come to Jerusalem. So we've gone from Samaria to Jerusalem. So there's no symbology going to be used here. It just says Jerusalem. So we can compare Samaria and Jerusalem. And by the way, Samaria is both a country and the capital. It can be understood both ways. So when it says the head, it's the head of the country, Samaria the city, and now we've got Jerusalem. So, wherefore hear the word of the Lord, ye scornful men that rule this people which is in Jerusalem. So he's talking to the leaders in Jerusalem. So he's talking to the leaders here. And we already established that he was referring to the leaders in the country of Samaria, which would be the city of Samaria, which was the head. Are we okay with that? So, talks about scornful men. Now again, we're not going to do a detailed study on all of this, but these scornful men who rule Jerusalem, from verse 15 onwards, what they're doing, the reason why they're scorning or being scornful, is not so much how they're dealing with the people, whether they're good or bad leaders. They're really scorning the message that God is giving them. So verse 15 says, because ye have said, we have made a covenant with death, and with hell are we in agreement. When the overflowing scourge shall pass through, it shall not come unto us. For we have made lies our refuge, and under falsehood we have hid ourselves. Wherefore thus saith the Lord God, behold, I lay in Zion. We're going to skip verse 16, we're going to go to 17. Judgment also will lay to the line, and righteousness to the plummet. And the hail shall sweep away the refuge of lies, and the waters shall overflow the hiding place. We read verse 2. In verse 2, there was a person, and the person equaled tempest of hail, destroying storm, mighty waters. Are we okay with that? Those three things. And then verse 17, it says hail and waters. So can we see the same symbol is being used in verse 2 and verse 17? Verse 17 says, and the hail shall sweep away the refuge of lies, and the waters shall overflow the hiding place. So all of that is the judgment that's being brought to view in verse 17. Judgment will I lay to the line, righteousness to the plummet, and the hail shall sweep away the refuge of lies. So there's some lies going on in Jerusalem, and it's all going to be swept away. In verse 2, it was going to be swept away by a strong and mighty person. Okay with that? Let's drop back to verse 15. We, the leaders in Jerusalem, have done what? They've made a deal. They've made a deal with who?
Death.
With death and hell. So, death and hell, we'll write that. Death and hell. They've made a deal with death and hell. Death and hell are one thing, death and hell. And what was the deal that they made with death and hell? When the overflowing scourge shall pass through, it will not come to us. We have made lies our refuge, and under falsehood we have hid ourselves. So let's summarize verse 15. We didn't really go deep into 16. 15, 16 and 17. We haven't even read verse 18, which we really should do. We'll read verse 18. And your covenant with death shall be disannulled, and your agreement with hell shall not stand. When the overflowing scourge shall pass through, then you shall be trodden down by it. So we've got the treading down here, and we also read the treading down in which verse? Verse 3, trodden underfoot. So what I want us to see, when you compare the two sets of stories, we've got Samaria and Jerusalem. And in both stories, they're going to be destroyed. Samaria didn't say that they went into some kind of deal or some kind of arrangement, but it does with the people in Jerusalem. So it says that they went into a deal with hell and death, which means that they talk to hell and death and they say, when all of these things happen, we're going to be safe and secure. Are we okay with that? What are the things that are going to happen? Samaria is going to be destroyed. When Samaria is going to be destroyed by that mighty one, what are the people in Jerusalem going to say? We are safe. That storm, that flood that swept over Samaria is not going to come to us. We've made a deal, we've made an arrangement that we're going to be kept safe. But what does God say? That covenant is a covenant of truth or a covenant of lies? It's a covenant of lies. And that storm that sweeps over Samaria, what will it do? It will sweep over you. It's the same storm, it's the same flood, therefore it's the same strong and mighty one. Who was the strong and mighty one that did Samaria, that destroyed Samaria? It was the Assyrians. But who's going to come and destroy Jerusalem? The Babylonians. But the Bible is going to speak about them as the same entity or the same person, the strong and mighty one. But we've already read from Jeremiah that he says the lions, first the Assyrians, then the Babylonians, or Nebuchadnezzar. It says it that way. In Habakkuk, it said that God's going to do a miracle. Before the destruction of Jerusalem, what will happen? He's going to raise up the Chaldeans, the Babylonians. If you're going to raise them up, what must he do? He must bring down the Assyrians. The Assyrians must be brought down for the Babylonians to be raised up. So, if the Assyrians have a role in society, in the geopolitical realm, we call them the king, the superpower. If they're brought down and the Babylonians come up, what role do the Babylonians have? The same role that the Assyrians had. So if we gave the Assyrians a crown and they got taken down, what would happen to that crown? It'd be given to the Babylonians. So the Babylonians share the same crown that the Assyrians had. Therefore they become the same person or the same strong and mighty one. We would call that people the king of the north, or the crown of the north, or the people of the north. So the Assyrians, king of the north, they're here. There's a prediction that they're going to be brought down here. They get brought down somewhere in this history between Habakkuk and Jeremiah. They get brought down. The Babylonians are going to be raised up, steal their crown, and therefore they become the same person. We're okay with all of that? Good. The reason why all of this becomes important is two verses in the book of Isaiah, chapter 28, verse 10 and verse 13. So these are two famous passages that we use over and over again. For precept must be upon precept, precept upon precept, line upon line, line upon line, here a little and there a little. Verse 13, for the word of the Lord was unto them precept upon precept, precept upon precept, line upon line, line upon line, here a little and there a little, that they might go and fall backward and be broken and snared and taken. Now, it's not my purpose to explain what these verses are referring to in their original proper context. But I want us to see that it's a lot more complicated, especially when you read verse 13, than we give in this movement. When we say line upon line, what do we say that means? History. We just say it's history. So we just take the word line, we actually create it into a literal line, obviously diagram here, with the beginning and the end, and then we take another line, because it says line upon or on top of one line, and we would call this the line of Moses and the line of Christ, and then we have other lines, as you all know. So all these lines, that's how we use this phrase in both verses. So you can already see, hopefully, that when you see the context of what's being discussed here, that Isaiah is not talking about this. Hopefully we can see that. He's not talking about line upon line in the way that we use it. He's talking about something different, but we will take that phrase and we will develop a methodology or a way of studying that looks like this. And that's good, that's all fine. Particularly in verse 13, it says, the last part, that they might go and fall backward and be broken and snared and taken. So this idea of being broken and snared and taken, who would you be broken and snared or taken by? Who's going to do that? Verse 2, the mighty and strong one. So whether it's the Samaritans or the people from Jerusalem, they're all going to be broken, snared and taken and fall backward. And all of that is in relationship to this idea of line upon line or precept upon precept. Now, what we didn't do when we looked at this chapter is show where you go from the 10 tribes to the 2 tribes, where you go from Samaria to Jerusalem. Because by the time you get to 14, verse 14, he's already switched to Jerusalem. You can see that. Verse 1 is Samaria, clearly. Verse 14 is Jerusalem, clearly. Where did the switch happen where God stopped speaking to the Ephraimites or the 10 tribes and he says, now I'm talking to the 2 tribes? Was it in verse 14 or was it a little bit before that? So if you were going to do a study on this subject, it becomes vital that you know where that transition happens. And in our movement, we really don't pay much attention to lots of questions that we could and should ask, and that's an important one, where we would want to take that transition or cut-off point from. It becomes an important question to ask. So I'm not going to prove or demonstrate where that would be. I'm just going to state it as fact. I'm going to tell you that it's before verse 7. By the time you get to verse 7, now God is not dealing with the 10 tribes, Samaria. Now his focus of attention is going to be in or towards Jerusalem. So the transfer happens somewhere before. We already went to verse 4, so you know it's somewhere in verse 5 and verse 6. So what you would really want to do is read verse 5 and 6 and see in those words if you can show where the transition is happening of he's speaking to Samaria and now he changes to Jerusalem. It's somewhere in verse 5 and 6. We're not going to discuss it. I want to leave that for you to meditate and contemplate on. But by the time you get to verse 7, now he's focusing upon Jerusalem. It's not talking about the 10 tribes now. Now this is the 2 tribes. But they also have erred through wine and through strong drink. How do we know the transition has happened, by the way? What did you say? What word did you say?
I said they've erred already.
They've erred already? Strong drink? My sister says the word also. If I said the word also, I'll change the word as well as. So if as well as means in addition. So someone is doing something, and in addition to them, or also as well as, someone else is doing something. What is the first group doing? The drunkards of Ephraim, verse 1. Drunkards of Ephraim have done what? They've been made drunk. And then it says, but they also. So this is Jerusalem. So this is Jerusalem. They have also erred through wine and through strong drink. Now, you know, this is English, and there's various ways that we could read English, and someone might argue that they also is talking about or repeating in large of the Samaritans. But I would argue that it's not so. Contextually, it's not a repeating in large, it's a continuation. It's the Samaritans have done one thing, and the people in Jerusalem have done the same thing. When I mean repeating in large, it's not the Samaritans have done this and the Samaritans have done the same thing in verse 7. It's speaking about them. It's speaking about a different group of people. They, the Jerusalemites, as well as the Samaritans, have drunken wine. So, when we start talking about line upon line, what does that mean, this concept of line upon line? The way we have used it in our movement is in a very specific and limited fashion. Now, as I say, we're not going to look at the exact usage of how this is going to work in Isaiah chapter 28. But what I want to say is this. Just want to give, from verse 7 onwards, say verse 7 to verse 13, this is what I think God is going to offer his people. He says, I give you two choices. You can either learn through history or instruction. So God's going to give you two options. So you're going to learn through instruction, and there's going to be two types of instruction. The first type would be history. How would history instruct you? How does history instruct you? What's instruction for?
So that you don't repeat.
So you don't repeat. Instruction is there to help you in your daily life, yeah, to get on with things. So to learn, he's going to give you some instruction, and you can be instructed by history. So the way you get instructed by history is you go back to history and you see things that they've done right or things that they've done wrong, and you'll say, well, I better copy them or I better not repeat them. Yeah? So there's two ways of having some instruction. There's instruction that's history, but there's another type of instruction. So the other type of instruction is pain. And we see a lot of pain in Isaiah 28. We see that these people in Samaria, they've received pain, and their pain was immediate. The pain that they received, he grabbed hold of them and ate them. And the other symbol of eating them was stamping them down with his feet. This message of punishment. So you can be instructed by pain, or you can be instructed by history. If you're okay with that. We'll go to verse 12. And I just want to pick up the last part of the verse. It says, they would not hear. Now, this pain or punishment, who's going to be inflicted by? Verse 2. As someone who's strong and someone who's mighty. That means, if I said someone who's strong, someone who's mighty, relatively speaking, what does that mean? That they're strong. If they're strong, you're weak. So they're stronger than you. So when it says that they would not hear, if this strong person said to you, you've got to do something, is it sufficient to say, well, I'm not going to listen to you? Would that work? Would it work if a strong person says, you go and do this thing, and you say, well, I'm not going to listen to you? What would be the consequences?
Belted.
My brother says you'd get belted. Yeah? Pain or punishment. So when it says that he was going to do something for them, but they would not hear, which one is it referring to when it says they would not hear? So if I said to you, I want to give you some instruction, and you say, I'm not going to listen to your instruction, which one would it be dealing with, this one or this one?
History.
The history one. It's this one. I'm going to say, look, I want to help you out. Let's fix the problem that you're in. And the way we're going to fix it is by history. And you're going to say, I'm not going to listen. Therefore, you wouldn't be instructed. So, the other way to be instructed or to learn is through punishment. In this one, you don't have a choice. You just stand there and you're going to be belted, as you said. You're going to receive this. You don't have to hear anything. You don't have any control. You don't have any power. So what God is doing is He's offering you two alternative ways to learn. And who's He speaking to?
Jerusalem.
He's speaking to Jerusalem. He's saying, you've got two choices. You can either learn through history, or you can learn through pain. Take your choice. And we already know what the answer is going to be. What's the answer going to be? We will not
Listen.
hear. We will not listen. What did Habakkuk say?
They won't hear.
Verse 5. You will not believe it, though it be told you. Chapter 2, verse 1 says, I'm going to go on my watchtower and I'm going to answer when I am reproved, told off, rebuked, because they're not going to listen. So it's all going to be set up that the people are not going to listen. However, will some people listen?
Yes.
Yeah, how do we know some people are going to listen? Because in Habakkuk it said what? And the Lord answered me, 2:2, write the vision, make it plain upon tables, that someone is going to do what?
Take it.
He's going to read and he's going to run with that message. He's going to give the message. So someone is going to take heed. So when you start connecting these three prophets together, they're not the only three, we could go to other ones, you can see that there's a message that's going to come to the people in Jerusalem, and they've got two options. You can either go to history and learn that way, which is called line upon line, this foolish way, as it's described in Isaiah 28, this childish way, this pathetic way, or you can learn through pain and punishment. The people in Jerusalem scorn all of this, and they're certain, because of their status, their relationship with God, that when the strong one comes to destroy Samaria, what will happen? It will overflow and pass over Jerusalem. It won't touch them. This death that's coming to the Samaritans. And God says, this arrangement that you've made, which is all built upon lies, will not work. Now, in the immediate context, when it says instruction through history, what is the history? It's the history of?
Samaria and Jerusalem.
Good, it's the history of Samaria. That's the immediate context. He says, look at this history, and when it happens, you see what's headed in your direction. So they're not going to learn from this one piece of history here. But it's not just that one piece of history. It's all the histories that have come, which is why we as the movement take this idea of line upon line, precept upon precept, or rule upon rule. So in Isaiah 28, this idea of line upon line is hopefully well established. Now, the reason why I wanted us to review this in this study is we've come to a time period in the life of this movement where everything that can be shaken is being shaken. And what people do when they become dissatisfied, I don't know if you use this phrase here, they pick at straws. They nitpick at little issues or little ideas, little problems, little ideas, and they forget the overarching themes of what we're dealing with. I'll give you one example, which is not the example that we want to deal with today. We've just dealt with history, and for history to give you some instruction means that what God does not want you to do is to repeat the mistakes of the past. Would that be a fair way of saying that? That's how history would help you. Don't repeat the mistakes of the past. So history has this idea of repeat. We talk about repeat often. So we use this idea of repeat and enlarge. We're all hopefully familiar with that. And if we talk about repeat and enlarge, I want to use this idea of repeating patterns. So we're familiar with this idea of repeating patterns, which means repeating histories or repeating stories. Instead of putting patterns, we could put story or history. Repeating stories, repeating patterns, repeating histories, if you're okay with that. The word that we use in our movement, and we've used this for a while now, is the word fractals. The word fractal is a mathematical term. It has a precise definition, and in its simplest form, it means repeating patterns. It can be understood in a number of different ways, but I just want to give two. One of them is actually repeating patterns. The word that's used, the mathematical word that's used, is called tessellations. I think that's how you spell it. Tessellations. And if you just go onto Google Images or something and you just put tessellation artwork or something like that, it will give you pictures of what a tessellation is. It's a repeating pattern or a mosaic. Tiling is often a tessellation. So if we had a floor and that floor was tiled and we had something that looked like this, oops. So black and white tiles, that would be a tessellation. Tessellation is when you get two shapes and bring them together, butt joint them, and there's no gaps. So you can see that there are no gaps anywhere here. Now, if you're really clever, you can have many different shapes, many different tessellations. It doesn't have to be squares. You can have curves, you can have angles. So one form of fractals is repeating patterns or tessellations. The Bible speaks about tessellations in the book of Esther chapter 1. The book of Esther chapter 1, it doesn't use the word tessellations, but it refers to tessellations, which is another word or another form of fractals. In our movement, when we speak about fractals, we don't just speak about tessellations. In fact, often we don't really speak about tessellations. What we speak about is patterns at various scales. So we talk about repeating scales. And when I mean scales, I mean like something that goes from big to medium to small. You can take something and you can scale it up and scale it down. And the concept of scaling becomes critical. And the reason why it becomes critical is because every single one of us as Adventists understands the concept of scaling. The traditional understanding that Adventists hold when we think about Revelation chapter 13, the mark of the beast, the seal of God, is the Sunday law. We're all familiar with that concept? Of course we all are. Now, that concept of the Sunday law, that test that we're about to face, who will face that test? Who is that test going to be brought to? We'll go small and then work up. What's the smallest unit? You.
Yeah, God's people.
So, not even God's people, just you. So, it's one person,
Individual.
the individual. Then, it's who? God's people. We'll call it the church. Then, the Gentiles. We'll call it the world. And this is a scaling. Adventists are pretty small, about 12, 20 million of us. Just a drop in the ocean compared to the world. So that test has to be scalable. If we're okay with that? Same test, the same pattern. So if this was a symbol of the test, or a measuring stick, or a scale, I'd come and bring this to you and I'd measure you, yeah? Pass or fail. Then I'd take the same test, the same scale, the same ruler, and I'd bring it to God's people, the church. A much bigger scale, but it's the same issue. And then you take the same one and bring it to the world. Are we okay with that? Yeah, so the concept of scalability, without us perhaps thinking about it, is well understood, accepted in Adventism, that the test has to go from the individual to the world. Ellen White might call it from nation to nation. So instead of just going to the world, we'd have to say from a big country, a small country. So all I want us to see, it's scalable. So when we think about fractals, we can have repeating patterns, and we can have this concept of scale. So when we think about scale, we don't often think in this way, but we often think about a time period, either a long time period or a short time period. Sometimes we think about groups of people, as we've just done here. So there are many ways of understanding scalability. So I'm sure you've already seen stories like this, or lines. This is the line of the 144,000. Begins at the time of the end, and we'll just say it goes to the close of probation. In this history, there are other scales. There are other groups of people that are going to be dealt with. And so you've seen stories that look like this, which are other scales. We might call them the priests, Levites, and Nethinims. So it's the same story, the same pattern, but they're at different scales, dealing with different groups of people. Now, the reason why I mention fractals is because when we started understanding this concept of repeating patterns and started dealing with scalability, we chose to use the word fractals. It's a mathematical term. But that word fractal is also used by other groups of people who hold to religious views. We might call it, say, the New Age movement. So the New Age movement uses the idea of fractals, and they use it in different ways. They can use it with scalability. They can also use it with tessellation. Has anybody ever seen the imagery or the logo of yin and yang? Yeah? It's this sort of white and black pattern. Sometimes people use the, I don't know if you do it here, of recycling. There's a similar logo that's used, and it's supposed to be this sort of cycle of black and white that sort of goes around and never ends. and it's all to do with this, you know, the cycle of life or the wheel of life. So they use fractals in these varying ways of scalability and tessellation or repeating patterns. And now because New Age people use that, there have been people in our movement when they have that have objected to the use of fractals because they say it's a New Age concept, it's a New Age idea, and they're not willing to take it at its face value, which is a mathematical term. They become disgruntled at the use of this word. And because we chose to use this word, they see it as evidence of us entering into spiritualism, because we're using a spiritualistic word as they would see it. Hopefully, most of you recognize that that is utter foolishness, to actually take a word that many people use and to say because one group of people use it in a worldly sense or a spiritualistic sense, it must be bad. So if we were to say the Church of Satan, because Satanists use the word church and they want to call their organization or their group of people the church, that means that the word church actually has connotations that's connected to spiritualism or Satanism. So if we call ourselves the Church Triumphant, we must therefore be something that's bad because it's the word that's connected with Satan worship. It's as foolish as that. The reason why I want to make this point is there are many things that we can be shaken over. And I'm sure all of us are aware that we're currently in a period that this movement has been shaken and is being shaken. And one of the things that people are bringing up is the issue of dispensations, or the idea of dispensationalism. So this word has been used quite frequently in our movement, and no one has ever had a problem with the usage of this word until the last 2 months. We're now in a place where this movement has had its most severe and significant split. There's a huge shaking that's happening. It's ongoing in our movement. And one of the things that people are being shaken over is the usage of this word dispensation or dispensationalism and what that means. Now the reason why people are objecting to it is because this word can mean different things to different groups of people. You've all heard of the term, taken from the book of Revelation, the false prophet. All of us are familiar with that, false prophet. Now, another way of using the word false, or the phrase false prophet, if we were to identify this entity, I would call it Protestantism, or apostate Protestantism. So apostate Protestantism is a synonym, another phrase that's used for the term false prophet. False prophet, apostate Protestantism. You can use them interchangeably. And this word dispensationalism is used by this body of people. And the way they use that phrase, that word dispensation or dispensationalism, they have, I don't want to say it's the only way they understand it, but they can use this word in a particular context that they want to make some prophetic or doctrinal point or statement, which is fair enough. Now, we've used this word in our movement for a long time, and when we've used it in the context of line upon line. And everyone in this movement knows that that's what we've done. It's been understood and recognized from the very beginning when people have used that word. But today, those people, those people who have left this movement, what they're now doing in their critique of the work of God's movement is to review what has been taught in the past and what is currently being taught, and to critique it. And one of the critiques that's come up, which is being used to say that we are now teaching error, and I use the word now teaching error, is that we use this word dispensations or dispensationalism. And because we've taken this word from apostate Protestantism, this is what they teach, it's proof that this movement, us, those in this room, those of you who are listening to myself and other presenters, other teachers, have entered into error, because what we're doing is we're taking apostate Protestant terms like dispensationalism and introducing it into our message. And this is the same foolish argument that people used for the word fractals or tessellations, repeating patterns, or scalability. It's the same argument that because one group of people take a word and use it to their own end, if we chose to use the same word, it doesn't make that word evil, ugly, or bad. We use the word dispensation in a very specific and, I'm going to say, correct way. So just so that you know, the word dispensation wasn't invented by me. It wasn't invented by this movement. In fact, it's a word, I don't want to say it was invented by Paul, because Paul didn't speak English like we do, but it's actually found in inspiration. It's a word that's used 4 times in the scriptures, all in the New Testament, all by Paul. It's in 3 books: 1 Corinthians, Ephesians, and the book of Colossians. I'll give you the verses. It's 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 17. 1 Corinthians 9, 17. Ephesians 1:10. Ephesians 3:2. And Colossians 1:25. 4 verses all deal with the word dispensation. So I'm just going to read them to us. For if I do this thing willingly, I have reward. But if against my will, a dispensation of the gospel is committed unto me. Ephesians 1:10. That in the dispensation of the fullness of times, he might gather together in one all things in Christ, both which are in heaven and which are on earth, even in him. If ye have heard of the dispensation of the grace of God, which is given me to you word. And Colossians 1:25. Wherefore I am made a minister according to the dispensation of God, which is given to me for you to fulfill the word of God. So the word dispensation, if you look at its normal usage in the English, it would give one definition, but obviously in the context of inspiration as it's used here, it's a Greek word. If you went to the Greek word and began to break down what this word means, if you went to Thayer's definition of it, it actually means the management of a household or household affairs. So, I'll give that again. So it's to do with the management of a household. So if I were to ask you, all of these verses that we're speaking about, when it talks about, if I were to ask you the household, what would that mean? household? In the context, what would the household be in these verses? What would that be talking about when it said the household? God's what? God's family. We'll go with God's family. A household is obviously a building, but it's not the building itself. It's not the house. It's the people who live in the house, the household, the people of God. So when it talks about dispensation, it's talking about the management of God's people. That's a simple, I call it a biblical definition, if we can use that term loosely. It's a Thayer's definition of what dispensation means. It means how you manage the affairs of God's people. When you look at the context of these passages, we only read the verse itself. You'd have to look at the context, not only of the verse, the chapter, and then the book itself. When you start dealing with the household of God, the reason why I was reticent to use the word church and wanted to use the word family of God or the household of God is because in the New Testament we're in a period of flux. And what I mean by that is that you've got the Jews, the Hebrews, the disciples, and you've got people joining them, which is the Gentiles. The people who join them, those Gentiles, are they God's people or are they Satan's people? If I can say it that way. They're from the world. They're not from the church. Who would you call them?
Satan.
Satan's people? Everyone would go with Satan's people? So if I took that story and put it to one side and did this fractal thing, which would be repeating patterns, and I took you to Revelation 18 verse 4, don't need to turn there, Revelation 18 verse 4, it says her. Who is her in 18 verse 4? Sorry? It's the world, Babylon. It says, come out of the world, Babylon, who? My people. Who is the my? God. So come out of the world, God's people. So if we took that and brought it back to the story of Christ, all those people that are coming from the world, are they the people of Satan or are they people of God? They're the people of God. But they're in Satan's kingdom, but they're people of God, yeah? So we're now dealing with the dispensation, which means the management of God's people. So is the management of God's people changed in the New Testament when Paul has written how God's going to manage things with his people? I'm going to say yes on two levels. Before, when you asked about how you manage the affairs of the house, the household, how you do things, the rules and regulations of the house, have the rules and regulations changed? Yes, there's been a big change because before, to keep things in order, you had to do sacrifices. And now, to manage the household, you do sacrifices. No. So the management has changed. Sacrifices before and no sacrifices now. So then we deal with the management of God's church or the household. Before, could his people that lived in the world join? Could they join? Uriah who was Bathsheba's husband called? Uriah the Hittite. So he wasn't an Israelite. Could he join the church? Sure. So he could join, no problem. And now can Cornelius join? Yes. So has the management of the household of God changed at that level? No, it's not changed. When Uriah wanted to join, what was the rules? What was the management? When we talk about management, we talk about managing, which is all about rules. What's the rules to join? Marriage. Circumcision. So he needs to be circumcised to join. as he marries the church. He's going to join the church. That's what you mean by marrying. The symbol of that is circumcision. Cornelius, does he need to get circumcised? No. What does he need to do? Needs to be baptized. So the management of God's household, has it changed? Yes. So there's been some management changes, but have the principles changed? No. No principle change. God's household needs to be managed before, if he said before the cross, it needs to be managed after the cross. You need to follow rules. If you want to join the church and you're a Gentile, can you join? Of course you can join. The worship style, if I can say it that way, has changed. Before it was sacrifices, now it's not sacrifices. Those sacrifices were lambs before. The sacrifice now is Christ. So do we still believe in sacrifice? Of course we do. So if you just take the idea of sacrifice, there's been no change. But the management of that sacrifice has changed. So when we start thinking about dispensation or dispensationalism, the way this movement has understood it is the management of God's church has changed from one time period to another. So when people start telling you that this movement now is using dispensationalism and we stole it from apostate Protestantism, that is a flat, outright lie. We did not get the word dispensationalism from apostate Protestantism. Depending upon how you want to argue who actually wrote the English Bible that most of us read, the King James Bible, you can argue that it was written by Protestants in England, and when they wrote that English version, they decided to get that Greek word, and what did the Greek word mean?
Management.
The management of the household, or the management of God's people. We'll say the management of the church. They took that word, the management of the church, and they changed it into what? The word dispensation. And if you look at the regular meaning, the vernacular, what the common usage of the word dispensation, it would mean that in a certain time period you behave in a certain way, and another time period you behave in a different way. That's how Paul uses it when he says the dispensation of grace. What does that mean? It means the management of God's church in this period of grace is going to be one way, and in a different time period it was another way. Now, this word dispensation comes from another word which means the person who's in control of the house. We might call it the distributor, or we might call it the manager or the overseer, or the person whose job it is. So there's the management of the house. If you have a management, what do you need to have? A manager. So you have management, you have a manager. So you can see this word dispensation goes from the management of the house to the manager, and that word is broken down into two, which is the house, obviously, and then it's either, when it talks about the management or the manager, it's the one who talks about or instructs on the law or the rules and regulations of the house. So the word dispensation says, or is dealing with, the laws, the rules, the regulations that are in or govern the church. Do we agree with that? That's the definition of it. So if you see that, you know that the rules that govern the church before the cross and after the cross change. If we're okay with that. So we know that there is a dispensational change from before the cross to after the cross. And not only do apostate Protestants But also Ellen White uses that word dispensation in that same context. It's the rules that govern how the church operates from one age to another. And what dispensation are we living in? According to Paul, we're living in the dispensation of grace. Ellen White might use the phrase, we're living in the dispensation of Christianity. In the dispensation of Christianity, are there different dispensations? For certain there are. There are dispensations that deal with no time setting, and there are dispensations that deal with time setting. We know that because the Millerites from 1798 are living in a time period where the rules that govern the church are now going to have time introduced to those rules that govern the church. Are they not? We know they are. Daniel 8:14. Prior to that, you could not deal with the subject of time. So this idea of dispensationalism is well grounded in our movement's history, and we are not changing the way it's being used. Ellen White often uses a different word, not dispensation, but she uses the word dispensation over and over again. In fact, she talks of the word dispensation, just the word itself, 246 times. If we were to turn to the Great Controversy, this would be chapter 19, Great Controversy, page 343. GC 343, paragraph 1, says the following. The work of God in the earth presents from age to age a striking similarity in every great Reformation or religious movement. So I just want to take that one sentence and pick up a few words. She talks about striking similarity. Where do we see striking similarity here? We see repeating patterns, striking similarity. So we've got repeating patterns which are nothing more than fractals. This is GC 343, paragraph 1, chapter 19. So from age to age we see repeating patterns, and that age to age is nothing more than Isaiah 28's line upon line, which is nothing more than how to manage God's household, the rules by which it's governed, which is dispensation after dispensation. So from one dispensation to another, we see repeating patterns. The reason why this subject has become an issue in our movement is the following. If we had kept the word dispensation and we had kept it at this scale here, Isaiah 28 scale, those people who have left this movement, Future for America and all of their followers, this issue of dispensationalism and the accusation that we've stolen it from apostate Protestants and we're now into spiritualism would never have been an issue. It would have never been a point of contention, because they believe in Great Controversy 343 from age to age. From age to age, they know that, and they believe in the concept of striking similarity, which is repeating patterns, which is fractals. So they're not attacking fractals because they're comfortable with that word, even though other people who have left the movement are not comfortable with it. But what they're not comfortable with is the word dispensationalism in the direction in which we have taken it. Just want us to see that they would be comfortable with age to age, line upon line, and they would be forced to agree with from dispensation to dispensation, because Paul himself in these passages says what? The dispensation of, do you remember what he said? Of grace. The dispensation of grace. When does the dispensation of grace come into effect if we were thinking here? Where would you be in the dispensation of grace? Just according to Paul's, just a general concept or an idea that Paul would give you. When would grace begin?
Genesis 3, the fall of man.
No. It'd be here. Because he says, you're in the time of grace now. If you went to the book of Galatians, it says, before you were under a schoolmaster, and now you're under a different set of rules. So, Paul's usage of the word grace, if you went to Hebrews chapter 8, he says, after those days, maybe we should turn there because people are turning there. So you're familiar with the passage, Hebrews 8 verse 10, my brother tells me. It says, for this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, saith the Lord. I will put my laws into their mind, and I will write them into their hearts, and I will be to them a God, and they shall be to me a people. And verse 11, and they shall not teach every man his neighbour. So we're not supposed to teach each other anything. We don't need to teach each other. Why? Because all of us understand things by ourselves, because the law is in our own heart. This is grace. This is the power of the gospel, or being spiritually minded. These are all synonymous terms that Paul uses. So when he says grace, or the dispensation of grace, he's talking about the history of Christ, beginning from Christ onward, or what we might call the dispensation of Christianity. So when we start talking about the dispensation of Christ, or the line of Christ, when FFA and their proponents would say that we're picking up an apostate Protestant term or concept with dispensationalism, they need to answer, you need to be certain that how is Paul using the concept of that very same word, the dispensation of grace, how is he using it? Is that the same way as apostate Protestants are going to be using it? Now this becomes a subtle argument, because the way apostate Protestants are going to use it is they're going to say from one dispensation to another there are going to be big differences or different tests or different issues, and that's why this issue has become a subject of contention. Do you remember this story here? The story of the 25-20. The 25-20 is one subject, the scattering of God's people. It can be broken down into how many parts? Two parts. The Millerites would call it two desolating powers. Paganism, papalism. Pagan persecution, papal persecution. Two desolating powers. So, in this story of the scattering, which is the management of the household of God, it comes in how many? I'm going to use the word dispensation. Two dispensations. Paganism and papalism. So the pagan persecution, the pagan dispensation, can then be subdivided into how many portions? 4. We go from 1 to 4. So this concept is nothing new. It's well understood because it's part of the subject of these charts. Now, in each story, you can see that there are specific issues that are going to be addressed or that are going to be dealt with. Specific tests that God's people, as they go through each one of these dispensations, they're going to have to deal with. What people can become confused about is that we need to understand these issues at two levels. How many dispensations is this? 1 and 4. It's 1 and 4 at the same time. Now, the issues that they're going to be dealing with are different issues. So there are 4 different issues, which means they come one after another. 1, 2, 3, 4. So it becomes a story of progression, how you get from the beginning to the end. But also, each one of those small histories, trouble with the Babylonians, it's the same trouble with the Greeks. It's the same trouble with the Romans. So they become a repeating pattern, which is right here. So we need to understand this issue in multiple ways. It's progression, 1, 2, 3, 4. But it's each of those histories that becomes a repeating pattern. We could call it persecution, 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 persecution. Just the same thing over and over again, repeated. So there are 2 ways to understand this: repeating patterns and progression. So if we can keep that in our minds, we also want to see that in this one dispensation, there are 4 dispensations. And you can already see, if you've got 4 dispensations, how many waymarks do we have in this small history here? 5. So you've seen this idea being developed over perhaps the last 6 months, probably longer. And we're just going to finish here. What we are now doing, when we start taking the concept of fractals, scalability, which is nothing more than the subject of dispensation, when we start taking the history of the priests, remember here, I did the 144,000, and then I did this. All of this is fractals, priests, Levites, and Nethinims. Not only are they fractals, but they're also dispensations, because what would we call this? The history of the priests. You can use that word, but you can also see use the phrase, the dispensation of the priest. The rules of engagement, the rules that govern God's house in this history are they the same as the rules that govern the Nethinims? No, they're not. They're different. Who brings the message to the priests? You don't need to answer that. Someone brings the message to the priests. Who brings the message to the Nethinims? Someone else does. So the message that's brought to the Nethinims is brought by an outside party, if I can say it that way, another group. The message that's brought to the priest is not done by an outside party. There's not another group that brings the message to them. They work out the message themselves. That's why I didn't want to say God. They work out the message themselves, but the Nethinims do not work out the message themselves. Neither do the Levites. So the rules of engagement, the rules or the management of the household of God is different in each one of those 2 histories. We can see that. The word dispensation means how you manage God's house. That means that dispensation is different to this one. So it's a dispensational issue. No one had a problem with that until recently. And the reason why we're having problems is because when you take this history, what have we done? We've taken our cue. We've gone back to this story here, and we've said this history of the 2520, these 1260 years of pagan persecution, which is how many dispensations? 1. Which was part of this dispensation, so it's 2 dispensations, but this one dispensation here, what could we do? In fact, not we, but what is the Bible instructing us to do? To take that one dispensation and turn it into 4. So we took that idea and we went to the line of the priest and we did the very same thing. Divided it into 4 dispensations. In Isaiah 28, we didn't talk about dispensations. We spoke about 2 models. The model of geography and the model of agriculture. And it's well established in this movement that the model of agriculture is in how many steps? 4 steps, or 4 dispensations. What's the subject of agriculture dealing with? The subject. It's not the house, it's what? It's the field. The field is where everything lives, just like everything lives in the house. So the rules or the management of the field here, is it the same as the management of the field here? No, it's different. How do you manage the field here? You plough. How do you manage the field here? You sow, and then you allow the plants to grow. We'll call that the former rain. The management of the field here we'll call the latter rain, and then we'll call the management of the field harvest. So the management of the field, taking a, don't want to say a biblical definition, but with the definition that's given in Strong's and Thayer's, if we can call that a biblical definition, the definition of the Greek word dispensation, the way we use it is completely consistent with everything that we've been teaching for many years now. There's no difference. When you start taking the agricultural cycle and you start dealing with the management of that field, it's the very definition of what dispensation actually means. So the management of the field is different in each one of those stories, the way the rules work. So what we have done is we've taken this and said this is how many lines. It's one line that goes from here to here. Therefore this is 1, this would be 2, 3, 4. This is progression. We can all see that. It's not repeating patterns. But what can we do? Babylonian captivity, Medo-Persian captivity. What's the repeating word? Captivity. So we've got captivity that repeats. Does it look slightly different? For sure, which is progression, but it's repeating. So here, what should we expect to see? A repeat. But the repeating theme is not captivity. But we have to see there's some kind of repeat that's going on. So what I'm going to say is, I'm not going to use the word captivity, I'm going to use the word test. So what's going to get repeated? That we're going to be tested at each stage. So the management of the field here, how do you know you've passed the test? What would you have done to the field? You'd have ploughed it. If you had ploughed the field, you would have got to the end of the ploughing where you would have said, all done, everything's good. When you test something, you go and examine it. I could have put examination there, but I've chosen to use the word test. All finished? What's the next thing you've got to do in your field? You've got to sow the seed. So as you've sowed the seed, how do you know the seeds have been sown? There was someone there checking it, but days, weeks, months later, what do you see? You see plants coming up. So they've come to this place and you can examine it, or you've been tested. Are there any seeds here? Are there any plants here? No. So the test is separate. Sowing of the seed, the ploughing of the field. There's totally different issues. Here, I used the word sowing, but we could have used the word rain. We could have tested or examined to see if the rain had come. This is both rain. Is rain rain? It is. It's the same thing. Are they different types of rain? Of course they are. They have different properties, different natures to them. The plants have changed substantially. This was a sapling or a germinated seed, and this is a plant that has fruit. There's no fruit here, there's fruit here. So you can see that in each dispensation, the rules of engagement are different. And here, it's harvest. Harvest looks nothing like ploughing, does it? It does. Because here, what do you do with a plough? You cut weeds down, and here you cut your harvest down. So it has similar properties, but as you said, it looks nothing like it. It's a totally different purpose. So I want us to see that there's this repeating concept, which is dispensationalism. And the reason why Future for America has now got a problem with dispensationalism, and they are disingenuously, which is a soft word of saying lying, they're saying that we now have taken an apostate Protestant term, and now we're introducing spiritualism or apostate Protestantism into our message. The reason why they're saying that is because they don't like this concept, this idea. And the reason they don't like this concept or idea is because it introduces an important principle for us to understand. Because when you put the waymarks into this story, and you say this is 1989 and 9/11 and 2014 and 2019 and 2021, when you start putting dates and the associated events that are being produced here, what they want to do is they want to have a continuum. They only want this one here. They don't want this broken up into parts, because as soon as you break it into parts, what it does is to say that you have a repeating pattern. And if you have a repeating pattern, then the story that's going on in this history is a repeat of what? A story that went on in this history. And now we're in a history here where Future for America and its leadership have now failed the test and have left the movement. Because we're in this dispensation number 3. In dispensation number 3, the test, you can pass or fail. Now you know that those who pass the first test, first angel's message if you want to use it that way, when it comes to the second test, could they pass or fail the second test, second angel's message? Yes, they can. They can pass or fail. All good and well. But if you're at the second test, if you had failed test number 1, first angel's message, can you pass the second? No, you cannot. So this is what the issue is. If you pass this one here, we'll call it test number 1. When you come to test number 3, can you pass or fail? You can pass and you can fail. You can pass or fail. Well, if you'd failed that test, when you came to here, can you pass or fail it? No, you will definitely fail. The problem is, if you take this story as progression and you don't see these individual tests, what they want us to believe is that this is one singular subject, one singular test. So it's a continuum. And what you cannot therefore do is point the finger to someone in this history and say, you have failed the test. Because they don't believe there's any test to be failed yet. It's only when you bring in the concept of dispensationalism that you can break up this one dispensation of the priest, and you can see that even though you pass this one, you can fail this one. And there is clear evidence now, the Future for America and all the people that follow them have failed the test in this dispensation, whilst at the same time all of those people had done what? Passed the test in this dispensation. So it's a perfectly viable option to pass here and fail here. And the reason why I just pick on these two is because of the subject matter. We know the Future for America and the leadership team there, they were the ones that were driving the testing message in this dispensation. They were the ones that created the test, if you like. They were the managers. They were the ones that were dealing with all the rules and regulations of how to manage the household of God. So they not only create the test, they pass the test. All good. But if you come to this dispensation, what they're unwilling to see is that now we're under new management. Because that's what this story teaches you, that we're now under new management, and if it's under new management, what would you get? You'd get new rules, new ways of managing the household of God. And they don't want new ways of managing the household of God. They don't want a new management. What do they want? The existing management. So therefore, they cannot accept the concept of dispensationalism. That's why this has become an issue. Because if we had just kept dispensationalism at this level and taken the straight "Thus saith the Lord" version of how the word dispensation is used in the scriptures, they would never have argued or fought against this point. It could never have been a problem. But it is now, not because we have the dispensation of the priests, no. It's because in the dispensation of the priests, just like the dispensation of paganism, there are 4 individual dispensations in that story. This is not something that we made up or created. It's not just taken from the agricultural model, from ploughing to harvest. It's inbuilt in the 25-20. The 25-20 is always our reference point to get virtually every single truth. I say virtually because I'm not aware of every one of them, but I would say 100% of the time, all of our truths are built upon, in some shape or form, the 25-20. The concept of 4 individual tests, 4 dispensations are here. New management, 3rd step, 3rd empire. This is new management. They're not the Babylonians. They're a new power. This management team is the new one. It's not Future for America, and that's why they are targeting this concept of dispensationalism. They're not attacking line upon line. They're not attacking fractals. They're not attacking repeat and enlarge or repeating patterns. They're not even attacking the 25-20. They're just saying dispensationalism is a apostate Protestant term, because the apostate Protestants say, this is their version of it, FFA's version, that you have specific tests that only are applicable to one dispensation, which is exactly what this model is teaching. It's not an apostate Protestant term or concept. It's a concept that's taken from the 25-20, which we have borrowed, which we have used. We have overlaid an agricultural model, which you can see clearly has 4 different tests, 4 different issues. And the problem is that the management here is different to the management there, and therefore it opens up the possibility, which now has become the certainty, the Future for America have fallen off the path into the wicked world below, because they no longer set the rules of engagement of how the household of God operates. They did it here. They create the rules and they pass. The new manager here, the management team here, create the new rules, and therefore they pass those rules as well. And if you don't agree with those rules, you fall into the world below. And it's clear to see by their own testimony, the Future for America no longer agree with the rules, with the management of the household of God. Therefore, by definition, they are no longer in the household of God, having fallen into the wicked world below. And it's all symbolized by the rejection of the word dispensationalism. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for your goodness and mercy. We want to ask and pray that you would be with us, guide us, and bless us. As we study the concept of dispensations, of dispensationalism, and what it means to us as a people, help us to not only study for ourselves, help us to become in tune with your voice speaking to us. Help us to see the dispensation in which we are living, the work that you are doing for us, the rules by which your house is now to be managed. We pray for this blessing in Jesus' holy name. Amen.